In case you missed it, EA Sports is releasing their new college football video game next week, College Football 25. And as a teaser for that game, EA released their top 10 offenses and top 10 defenses in the game. Last week, we took a look at those top 10 defenses. They were pretty atrocious. We feel like we fixed that rating. So for this week, we are taking a look at the offenses. But as always, welcome back, capital F football fans, to the O&O Sports YouTube channel. If you enjoy this upload and want to see more videos like this, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe. Share it to all your friends, your neighbors, your grandma, your papa, all of the above. And before we get into the top 10, let's talk about a few honorable mentions. Now, the first honorable mention is going to be the NC State Wolfpack. Pretty under the radar team heading into 2024. They add transfer quarterback Grayson McCall, who was an elite group of 5 quarterback at Coastal Carolina when he was healthy. Not so much last year, but apart from Grayson McCall, they return their leading receiver Kevin Conception. They also add former Ohio State wide receiver Noah Rogers, very touted high school prospect, and dynamic tight end Justin Jolie from UConn. Pretty stacked receiver room, pretty deep. Great tight end coming in. Like we said, tight end room also has underrated depth. As for the offensive line, they retain third team all ACC tackle Anthony Belton and ACC honorable mention guard Timothy McKay. They also bring in grad transfer center Zeke Correll from Notre Dame. Add a lot of great players onto that offensive line, which will help them out a lot this upcoming season. And as for running back, they bring in ACC third team running back Jordan Waters from Duke. They also have a redshirt freshman in Hollywood Smothers transferring in from Oklahoma, and they retain Kendrick Raphael, who had a good amount of touches for the Wolfpack in 2023. We have NC State at 13 and EA had them at 16, so we are a little bit higher on NC State coming into this season. And the next honorable mention, it's going to be the Oklahoma State Cowboys. This is for a pretty simple reason. I mean, they returned the best running back in the sport, Ollie Gordon, who rushed for 1,700 yards, 21 touchdowns by himself last season, should be the best running back in the country once again. As for the rest of the team, Alan Bowman did struggle with interceptions in 2023, but he's still solid. Really only has to work on those interceptions. Apart from that, he's a very decent quarterback. They also returned 2 top wide receivers from 2023 in Brennan Presley and Rashad Owens, who combined for over 1,800 yards and 11 touchdowns last season. And for the line, they return tackles Dalton Cooper and Jake Springfield, as well as center Joe Mikowski, who were all Big 12 honorable mentions in 2023. Now, EA surprisingly did not have Oklahoma State ranked in their top 25. Very disrespectful if you ask us. Oklahoma State is a very good offense. Ollie Gordon, obviously the best running back in the country. He's coming back again in 2024. Should automatically make them a very good offense. And if Alan Bowman can get it together, they should be even better. We have them 12th. And at 11, we have the Kansas Jayhawks. Now, this one is also pretty simple. Jalen Daniels is uniquely talented, but he also has to stay healthy in 2024. When he is on the field, he is great. He is a big playmaker, has NFL upside. They really need him to be healthy this season. They have their top 3 wide receivers from 2023 in Lawrence Arnold, Quentin Skinner, and Luke Grimm returning. Those 3 combined for over 1,900 yards, 14 touchdowns in 2023. As for running backs, they return their top 2 rushers also from 2023 in Devin Neal and Daniel Hishaw. Those 2 combined similarly to the wide receivers for 1,900 yards and 24 touchdowns. Now, Kansas actually probably would be higher on this list, but the offensive line does lose a lot of talent in guys like Dominic Pooney and Mike Nowitzki leaving. So we'll have to wait and see and how good that unit can be in 2024. But for what it's worth, 11 is nothing to sneeze at all. And EA had them ranked 14th, so also not that far off on our list. They come in at 11. And those were the honorable mentions. Let's get right into the top 10. At 10, we have the Penn State Nittany Lions. Now, this might seem like a surprise to some, but not to us. That offense was pretty good in 2023, despite the fact that Drew Aller was very limited at quarterback. But just because he was limited does not mean he was bad. I mean, most people forget he went 60% for completion with 2,600 yards, 25 touchdowns, and only 2 interceptions. So while he was limited, he he doesn't have a big arm. He didn't really make any mistakes, so pretty underrated as a quarterback overall. Other than Aller, they lose offensive linemen Fashanu and Nourzad, but they still retain a lot of talent on that offensive line. Penn State's perennially going to have one of the best offensive lines in the country. Their offensive line development is impeccable, one of the best in the country. So pretty safe to assume they're going to be good once again in 2024. And as for running backs, they returned both of their leading rushers in Katron Allen and Nick Singleton, who combined for over 1,800 yards and 14 touchdowns on the ground in 2023. As for that wide receiver room, it is pretty weak. They lose their top receiver in Keandre Lambert-Smith to Auburn, but they add Ohio State wide receiver Julian Fleming, who was a great prospect coming out of high school, never really found his footing at Ohio State, but he comes into Penn State to hopefully be that standout wide receiver one, ball dominant wide receiver that Penn State has needed the past couple years for Drew Aller to gel with. And we're pretty close with EA on this one too. They had Penn State at 12, we have them at 10. And at 9, we have the Alabama Crimson Tide. Now, the biggest thing for Alabama this upcoming season is retaining Jalen Milroe. He was great last year, probably didn't reach his maximum potential, honestly, but still great nonetheless. And you can't forget, he is a playoff appearing quarterback. Any quarterback with that kind of experience you want to keep around. Nick Saban, of course, left this offseason. Wasn't sure if he was going to stay or transfer out, but he is sticking with Kalen DeBoer, who is notoriously good at developing quarterbacks. And he could potentially be a top 3 quarterback in the SEC this year. The SEC is going to be stacked, so not saying that that is a given, but it is very, very possible. The offensive line also returns all SEC contributors in Tyler Booker and Caden Proctor, and they add a reliable center in Parker Brailsford from Washington. And despite losing a lot in terms of depth in that unit, they still maintain a good amount of depth overall. Still a very deep lineup, and that's just a testament to the job Nick Saban did there. That talent, even though they lost a considerable amount from last season, is still loaded. And speaking of loaded, those skill position players are also very good. They might look underwhelming at first look when you look at the 2023 production numbers returning, but likewise to the offensive line, Alabama's going to get to showcase some of the more underrated guys in that depth chart, like Kendrick Law, Kobe Prentice, and Emmanuel Henderson, who are 3 very highly touted wide receivers coming out of high school. Been at Alabama for a couple years, finally going to get some playing time, some meaningful playing time at least, in 2024. And the running backs, Jam Miller and Justice Haynes, are similar. Now, EA does have Alabama at 3rd, which we believe is a little high, but it's not unreasonable considering that talent level, like we said, just still absurd. Kalen DeBoer obviously is still going to need to implement his system, work out some kinks, and we're just overall not as confident that Alabama's going to have the 3rd best offense this season. And coming in at 8, we have the Miami Hurricanes. Now, the biggest thing for the Hurricanes is they had probably the most important acquisition in the entire transfer portal this offseason in obtaining quarterback Cam Ward. Cam Ward was looking like a 1st round draft pick quarterback. There were a lot of quarterbacks that went in this NFL draft. So he stays in college, transfers to Miami, and he immediately changes Miami's offense into one of the best in the ACC, and now what we consider top 10 in the country. Other than Ward, they also returned their top 2 wide receivers in Xavier Restrepo and Jacoby George, and they add a big target in Houston's Samuel Brown. Now, those 3 combined for over 2,700 yards and 17 touchdowns in 2023. Monster numbers there, but then again, Samuel Brown was at Houston. He was the primary receiver there, so a little bit inflated. But overall, they're still very underrated as a room heading into 2024. And they also have pretty decent depth at running back with Mark Fletcher and AJ Allen returning, 2 very solid backs from last season, and they add a 4-star in Jordan Lyle, who should come in, probably won't see that many touches, but very talented, could see the field in his freshman year. And they also returned all ACC contributors on the offensive line in Jalen Rivers and Francis Magua. And they add all Big Ten honorable mention Zach Carpenter from Indiana at center. Now, we're a little bit off from EA. They had them 1 spot higher at 7. We are just under that at 8, but pretty close all things considered. And if you think we are just reordering EA's list, this is where it takes a bit of a turn. At 7, we have the Tennessee Volunteers. Now, if you saw the ratings, you saw Tennessee was left off both offense and defense top 25. The running theory here at Ono Sports is that they just forgot Tennessee as a school, which is very disrespectful. Tennessee probably top 10 or top 12 in both offense and defense. We've talked about them extensively on this channel, so we will just summarize a little bit. Iamaleava is one of the best quarterback prospects we've ever seen, honestly, coming out of high school. He's going to get his first year starting this season. They have a deep and underrated running back room. Dylan Sampson leading that unit. Very, very good running back there. Pretty solid offensive line talent wise. The best player on that unit is probably guard Javontez Spraggins, and the wide receiver room returns and adds over 1,900 yards and 8 touchdowns from last year. We find it very disrespectful that EA didn't have them in their top 25. Not sure how they missed Tennessee on both lists. And at 6, we have the Ole Miss Rebels, the good old Fighting Lane Kiffins. Jackson Dart is projected to take another big leap in 2024, and for good reason. He has a good arm, he sees the field well, rarely makes bad decisions, can hurt you on the ground somewhat, but most importantly, he is going to have an elite wide receiver room this season. They return 2 of their top 3 receivers from 2023 and Trey Harris and Jordan Watkins, and they add a huge transfer from South Carolina wide receiver Juice Wells, immensely talented wide receiver. And speaking of adding talent, Ole Miss did a lot of that this past offseason. They add talent and depth on the offensive line in North Carolina tackle Diego Pounds and 2 Washington guards in Nate Kalepo and Julius Buelo, who should both see the field immediately at Ole Miss. They also have a pretty elite running back room. I know it seems like we're throwing around the word elite a lot in this video, but I mean, if you're going to have a top 10 offense, you're probably going to have a lot of elite talent on that side of the football. But in that running back room, they have Ulysses Bentley returning. He was behind Quinshon Judkins, but still produced a lot for that room in 2023. And they bring in 2 Miami transfers, but different Miamis. Miami, Florida transfer Henry Parrish, who was very good in 2023, and Miami, Ohio transfer Rashad Amos, who was one of the better running backs in all of the group of 5 last season. Altogether, that group combined for over 2,200 rushing yards, 23 touchdowns on the ground in 2023. And we think EA is underrating them a good bit. They had them at 13. We have them all the way up at 6, just missing out on the top 5. Still amazing nonetheless. And getting into the top 5, at 5, we have the Georgia Bulldogs. Now, one of the most commented things from the last video is people think Georgia is being a little bit underrated on our list. And for the most part, we think they could be too, but purely from a talent perspective, Georgia is not as good as some of the other teams that we see, both offensively and defensively. But as for coaches, they're going to get the most out of their guys. And likewise, Carson Beck is probably going to be gearing up for a top 3 SEC finish and potentially a Heisman candidacy in 2024. We might disagree with that, but he was amazing last season. 72% completion percentage, 3,900 yards, and 24 touchdowns in 2023. Very, very good numbers. And they return all SEC linemen in Tate Ratledge, Xavier Truss, and Dylan Fairchild. That unit is insanely deep. Very good, probably one of the best in the SEC, if not the best. They also return experienced wide receivers, but not huge contributors from 2023. Still immensely talented guys like Dominic Levet, Ra Thomas, and Dylan Bell. And they add Miami transfer Colby Young to go into the mix. Pretty good room there. We'll have to wait and see on how good of a unit they can be, largely unproven altogether. They also add a potential top 5 SEC running, top 3 even SEC running back in Trevor Etienne from Florida. That room is filled with experience, but not much production, similarly to that wide receiver room. And we think EA is overrating them a bit, and not for bad reason. Georgia has been very great the past few years. That coaching staff, like we said, is going to get the most out of them. Could easily outplay their talent ranking, but for us here at Ono Sports, we're going to have them at 5th. And at 4, we have the Missouri Tigers. Missouri is insanely talented coming into the season. Brady Cook returns. He's also bound for another top 3 SEC finish. I know we've said that for I think 3 or 4 guys at this point, so one of them's going to have to get left out, but we don't think it's going to be Brady Cook. He threw for over 3,300 yards and 29 total touchdowns last season, and he's going to have who we think is the best returning wide receiver and one of the best overall wide receiver rooms in the sport. They return Luther Burden, Weiss, Cooper, Johnson, who combined for over 2,700 yards and 18 touchdowns in 2023. And that line is also stacked. They return 3 all-SEC linemen in Cameron Johnson, Connor Tollison, and Armand Mimbo. And they add monster O-line transfers in Oklahoma's Caden Green and all AAC SMU transfer Marcus Bryant. Very, very stacked offensive line. The 8 deep is going to be amazing for Missouri this season. And unfortunately, they do lose Cody Schrader, who was one of the better running backs in the country last year, probably top 3, if not top 2. But to replace him, they add 2 great group of 5 running backs in Marcus Carroll and Nate Noel. Those 2 combined for over 2,100 rushing yards and 18 touchdowns at the group of 5 level in 2023. EA has Missouri at 9th, and we think that is just way too low for the amount of talent that Missouri brings in on offense. And coming into the top 3, we have at 3 the Ohio State Buckeyes. Now they're going to have one of the most talented rosters overall in the sport. And spoiler alert, if you have not seen the top 10 defenses, Ohio State was atop that list at number 1. And we'll get into conference outlook and championship predictions later this month. But as a sneak preview, Ohio State's probably going to be mentioned a lot in that episode. As for that offense, Will Howard comes in. He has a lot on his plate at Ohio State, but he was pretty good at Kansas State last season, had a 61% completion percentage, threw for over 2,600 yards and 24 touchdowns, and he was able to make strides on the ground. Now, it is going to be a much different ball game at Ohio State, but really all you have to do for Ohio State is be better than Kyle McCord, who wasn't terrible, but also really just threw the ball up to Marvin Harrison a few times and asked him to carry the load on that offense last season. And for that line, they return all Big Ten offensive linemen in Donovan Jackson and Josh Fryer, and they add former Alabama center Seth McLaughlin. Now, as an Ohio State fan, you might be wary of that addition because when Alabama went up against Michigan, Seth McLaughlin did not have a very good game. Not really what you want to see, but he is still massively talented, just happened to not have the greatest game against your biggest rival. And Ohio State's always going to have a great offensive line like Penn State that we said previously. They have amazing depth. They send people to the drafts almost every year. I think they've sent 5 linemen to the NFL in the past 3 years. So you're really not going to have to worry about that offensive line for the next few years at least. And on top of that, they're going to have the best running back tandem in the country in Trevion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins. Now, those 2 combined for over 2,000 yards and 26 touchdowns alone in 2023, and they add a lot of great depth and high 4-star James Peoples and 3-star Sam Williams-Dixon in that room. Henderson and Judkins are going to be the scariest duo for opposing teams in 2024. Wouldn't want to be a defensive tackle trying to take either of those guys down, or a linebacker for that matter once they hit the second level. And their wide receiver room is also full of talent. They add number 1 overall 2024 prospect Jeremiah Smith, should come in and immediately have an impact to go alongside Emeka Egbuka, the 2021 number 1 wide receiver, and Carnell Tate, the 2023 number 3 wide receiver. And we think EA has them a bit low at 5. We have them at 3. Very, very good overall offense going into this season. And at 2, we have the Texas Longhorns. Now, Texas, like Ohio State, is highly ranked on defense as well as offense, and for good reason. They return Quinn Ewers. Enough said, pretty much. He's been one of the best quarterbacks the past couple years at Texas. Nearly 70% completion percentage last year with almost 3,500 yards and 22 touchdowns. Great numbers there, and that wide receiver room is even more loaded, it seems like, than it was last year. They add transfers Isaiah Bond and Matthew Golden from Alabama and Houston, and they add 5-star Ryan Wingo, who like Jeremiah Smith at Ohio State, should come in and immediately contribute to some degree. And they also return wide receiver Jonte Cook, who was pretty good in 2023. But the most underrated is tight end Amari Niblack from Alabama. He is very underrated, great tight end, one of the better tight ends in the country, and he's going to be able to provide a security blanket for Quinn Ewers. Probably going to have a great season again in 2024. And with all that said, they return all Big 12 offensive linemen Kelvin Banks and Jake Majors, and their top end offensive linemen all have reps. They're going to be a deep unit, just like some of the other offensive lines we've talked about in this video. And their running back room is also being somewhat underrated. I mean, they lose their top rusher in Jonathan Brooks, but they retain 3 other top contributors in CJ Baxter, Jaden Blue, and Trey Wisner. Those 3 combined for over 1,100 yards and 9 touchdowns on the ground, despite Brooks eating most of the reps in 2023. Very scary for opposing defenses, and once again, we think EA is rating them just too low at 4. We have them at number 2. And at number 1, no real surprise to us, it is the Oregon Ducks. Now, where do we even start with Oregon? Every unit on that offense seems like it's either easily elite or arguably elite. So let's just start with Dillon Gabriel, the quarterback. He's been an elite quarterback since 2019. He's been in the sport that long, folks. And he had his best year so far at Oklahoma last season. He threw for almost 70%, over 3,600 yards, and 30 touchdowns through the air. But when you add in his rushing statistics, it's over 4,000 yards and 40 touchdowns combined, but who's counting? And in our opinion, he's gonna have the best wide receiver room in the country. They return 3 of their top 4 contributors from 2023 in Tez Johnson, Trayshawn Holden, and Gary Bryant. And they add 2022 number 1 wide receiver and top 5 transfer this past offseason, Evan Stewart from Texas A&M, who very well could be the best wide receiver in the sport. We have not been able to gauge how great he can be. Was really held back at Texas A&M. Going to get the opportunity to flourish at Oregon, and like we said, could be one of the better wide receivers in the sport, given the amount of reps he deserves. Those 4 together combined for over 2,500 yards and 24 touchdowns through the air in 2023. And on top of that, they retain all Pac-12 first team tight end Terrence Ferguson, who was also amazing for Oregon last season. And they have a very underrated running back room. They lose their RB1 in Bucky Irving. He goes to the NFL, but they retain Jordan James, Noah Whittington, and Jaden Lamar, who all got reps in 2023, similarly to Texas, in that those 3 combined for over 1,000 yards and 14 touchdowns, despite not getting the bulk of the snaps in 2023. And as depth, or possibly better, they add highly coveted D2 running back Jay Harris from what I believe was Northwestern Missouri State. I can't remember exactly, but he was amazing at the D2 level, over 1,400 yards on the ground. Probably going to see the field in his first year at Oregon. We'll have to wait and see on how much. And that offensive line is also very underrated. They return all Pac-12 contributors in Johnny Cornelius and Josh Connerly. They were very good all around in the Pac-12, but that was the Pac-12. Sadly, the Pac-12 is no longer with us. We'll have to wait and see on how they adjust to the Big Ten. Probably going to be a little bit more difficult if we had to guess, but they are still a very deep unit. Their top 10 offensive linemen have had reps at some point in their careers, and they add a solid transfer in Indiana's Matthew Bedford. And we think they are just 1 spot too low. EA has them at 2nd. We have them as the number 1 offense for this upcoming season. And that's going to do it for our top 10 offenses in 2024 for this upcoming season. Do you think we had a better list than EA? Let us know. If you think it's worse, you can let us know. Feel free to comment whatever you want. Feel free to comment what you had for lunch today. But if you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe, and go vote on our community tab for which team you want to see in our next 2024 season preview. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.